Long before the echoes of Roman legions marched across Europe, in the sun-drenched lands of the Aegean, around the late Bronze Age, roughly the 13th or 12th century BCE, the seeds of a monumental conflict were sown, leading to the legendary fall of Troy. It began not with clashing armies or political intrigue, but with a wedding, a celebration of divine love that inadvertently set the stage for human sorrow. The sea nymph, Thetis, whose beauty was said to rival the pearlescent depths of her ocean home, was destined to marry Peleus, a mortal king of Phthia. This union, orchestrated by the gods themselves, was meant to avert a prophecy that Thetis would bear a son mightier than his father, a son who might one day challenge the very supremacy of Zeus. So, a mortal king was chosen, a seemingly humble solution to a cosmic dilemma. The wedding feast was a spectacle of Olympian grandeur, held on Mount Pelion, where the air shimmered with divine presence and the nectar flowed like liquid sunlight. Every god and goddess of Olympus was invited, their laughter echoing through the sacred groves, their forms radiant against the earthly backdrop. Yet one deity was conspicuously absent, Eris, the goddess of discord. She, whose very essence was strife and contention, had been deliberately excluded, for who would wish such a disruptive force at a joyous occasion? But Eris, ever resentful of being overlooked, was not one to be easily dismissed. She arrived uninvited, cloaked in the shadows of her indignation, and in a moment of spiteful brilliance, she cast a single, gleaming object onto the banqueting table. It was a golden apple, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." This seemingly innocuous act plunged the divine celebration into immediate chaos. Three goddesses, each possessing unparalleled beauty and immense power, instantly laid claim to the apple. Hera, the queen of the gods, majestic and imperious. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, fierce and intelligent. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, alluring and irresistible. The argument escalated, their divine voices rising in passionate dispute, each certain of her own unparalleled claim. The other gods, accustomed to their squabbles, but wary of taking sides in such a delicate matter, wisely recoiled. Even Zeus, the mighty king of Olympus, found himself in an impossible predicament. To choose one would be to incur the eternal wrath of the other two, a price even he was unwilling to pay. And so, Zeus, in a stroke of divine diplomacy, decided to delegate the impossible task. He would not choose. Instead, the judgment would fall upon a mortal, far removed from the celestial squabble. His gaze settled upon Mount Ida, a verdant peak in the Troid region, where a young shepherd named Paris tended his flocks. Unbeknownst to Paris, he was no ordinary shepherd. He was, in fact, a prince of Troy, son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. But he had been left on the mountainside as an infant. A prophecy, delivered by the seeress Hecuba, foretold that her newborn son would be the ruin of Troy, a dark shadow cast over his birth. To avert this terrible destiny, he was abandoned, left to the mercy of the elements. Only to be found and raised by shepherds. This humble upbringing had shielded him from the intricate politics of his royal lineage, but it could not shield him from the machinations of the gods. Hermes, the swift messenger god, descended to Mount Ida, guiding the three resplendent goddesses to Paris. The young shepherd, startled by the sudden appearance of such celestial beings, was informed of his unenviable task. He was to judge which of them was the fairest. Each goddess, eager to secure the coveted apple, then proceeded to offer Paris a bribe, a testament to the lengths even deities would go to satisfy their vanity. Hera, regal and imposing, promised him power and dominion, the kingship of all Asia and immense wealth. Athena, sharp and strategic, offered him wisdom unparalleled in battle, the ability to conquer any foe, and glory in war. Finally, Aphrodite, with a beguiling smile and eyes that promised untold delights, whispered her offer. The love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris, a mortal swayed by mortal desires, found himself caught between immense power, unmatched wisdom, and irresistible love. The choice was agonizing, yet ultimately, his heart, perhaps guided by youthful longing or simply the inherent human desire for connection, leaned towards the promise of love. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite. This decision, seemingly a simple act of judgment on a remote mountainside, reverberated through the mortal and immortal realms, setting in motion a chain of events that would culminate in a decade-long war and the utter destruction of a mighty city. The scorned goddesses, Hera and Athena, their pride wounded and their wrath ignited, vowed vengeance against Paris and, by extension, against Troy itself. Their divine fury would become a relentless force, subtly and overtly influencing the conflict that was to come. Aphrodite, true to her word, prepared to fulfill her promise. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, the Queen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus. Her beauty was legendary, said to be so profound that poets would sing of it for millennia. She was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, her divine parentage perhaps contributing to her ethereal allure. Yet Helen was already married, and her abduction, however orchestrated, would be an act of profound transgression against the sacred bonds of hospitality and marriage. This is where a subtle historical detail comes into play. The concept of xenia, or guest friendship, was paramount in ancient Greek society. Violating xenia was considered one of the gravest offences. Inviting divine retribution, Paris, in taking Helen from Menelaus's home, would commit such a violation, further fueling the righteous anger of the Greeks. Paris, now emboldened by Aphrodite's favour, journeyed to Sparta, ostensibly on a diplomatic mission. He was received with the customary xenia by Menelaus, who offered him lavish hospitality. While Menelaus was away on a journey to Crete, Paris, with Aphrodite's aid, seduced Helen. Some ancient accounts suggest Helen was enchanted by Aphrodite, her will subtly bent to the goddess's purpose, while others depict her as willingly abandoning her husband and child for the allure of the handsome Trojan prince. This remains a point of scholarly dispute. Was Helen a helpless victim of divine intervention, or a willing participant in her elopement? The answer profoundly shapes one's view of her character and culpability in the ensuing war. Regardless of her agency, Helen departed with Paris, taking with her a significant portion of Menelaus's treasury, and sailed back to Troy. Upon Menelaus's return, the discovery of his wife's disappearance and the theft of his wealth ignited a furious rage. His honor, his marriage, and his kingdom had been deeply insulted. He appealed to his brother, Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae and the most influential ruler in Greece, for aid. Bound by an oath sworn by all the Greek chieftains during Helen's earlier courtship, readily agreed to rally the Achaean forces. Years before, when Helen was of marriageable age, her stepfather, Tyndareus, had made all her suitors swear an oath to defend her chosen husband if anyone ever tried to abduct her. This oath, a clever stratagem to prevent bloodshed among the powerful suitors, now bound the greatest heroes of Greece to Menelaus's cause. The call to arms went out across the Greek world, from the fertile plains of Thessaly to the rocky shores of Ithaca. Kings and heroes, bound by oath and a shared sense of outrage, began to gather their armies and their ships. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, whose mother was Thetis, the very nymph whose wedding started it all, was reluctantly drawn into the conflict. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, famed for his intellect, attempted to feign madness to avoid the war, but his deception was uncovered. Ajax, the mighty warrior, and Diomedes, the brave king of Argos, were among the many who answered the call. The assembly of such a vast and formidable armada, 1,000 ships, was an unprecedented undertaking in the Bronze Age Aegean, demanding immense logistical coordination and resources. It reflected the deep-seated cultural values of honor, vengeance, and the sanctity of marriage that permeated ancient Greek society. The stage was now set. The divine machinations, born from a golden apple and a fateful promise, had culminated in a mortal conflict of epic proportions. The abduction of Helen, whether by seduction or divine enchantment, provided the immediate casus belli. But beneath it lay the simmering resentments of spurned goddesses and the intertwined destinies of mortals and immortals. The winds of fate, stirred by Eris's apple, were now blowing inexorably towards the shores of Troy, carrying with them the hopes and fears of an entire civilization. The Trojan War, a conflict that would etch itself into the very fabric of Western consciousness, was about to begin, its origins rooted in a single divisive judgment. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The sun, a fiery orb, dipped below the horizon, painting the Aegean in hues of rose and violet, as Paris, the Trojan prince, set sail from Sparta. His ship, swift and sleek, cut through the gentle waves, carrying a prize that would soon plunge the world into an unimaginable conflict. Helen, the Queen of Sparta, the most beautiful woman in the world. Her departure, whether a willing elopement fueled by Aphrodite's promise or a forced abduction, would forever remain a subject of passionate debate among the bards and historians. Some ancient accounts, like those found in the Cypria, an early epic poem now largely lost to us, but summarized by later writers, suggest Helen was quite willing, captivated by Paris's charm and the allure of a new life. Others, particularly later Roman authors, cast her as a tragic victim, snatched against her will. The truth, like so many whispers from that distant age, is veiled by the mists of time and the biases of those who told the tale. Back in Sparta, a profound silence descended upon the palace, a silence more chilling than any storm. Menelaus, the king, had been away, attending the funeral of his grandfather, Catreus, in Crete. Upon his return, the empty chambers, the missing queen, and the whispers of his household staff confirmed the unthinkable. His wife, his beautiful Helen, was gone, spirited away by a foreign prince who had been welcomed into his home as a guest. The betrayal was a searing brand upon his honor, a wound that festered with each passing hour. His fury was not a roaring inferno, but a cold, relentless fire, burning with an unyielding desire for retribution. Menelaus, a man of considerable power and influence, did not hesitate. He immediately dispatched messengers across the Greek lands, their chariots thundering over dusty roads, their ships cleaving the waves, carrying the dire news. They bore a summons, a reminder of an ancient oath, a solemn pact made years before, when Helen herself was sought by countless suitors. At that time, her father, Tyndareus, fearing the inevitable bloodshed that would erupt over his daughter's hand, had made a shrewd demand. He had insisted that all the suitors swear an oath to defend Helen's chosen husband against any wrong done to him concerning his marriage. This was the famous Oath of Tyndareus, a binding promise that now, with Helen's disappearance, transformed from a safeguard into a catalyst for war. The messengers arrived at palaces and strongholds, at bustling ports and secluded farmsteads. They found Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, whose counsel was as revered as his age. They found Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, a man known for his sharp intellect and persuasive tongue. They found Ajax the Greater, a colossal warrior from Salamis, whose strength was legendary, and his cousin, Ajax the Lesser, a swift and agile fighter. And of course, they sought out the most powerful of them all, Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, the mighty king of Mycenae, whose dominion stretched far and wide, making him the natural leader of any combined Achaean force. Agamemnon, a man of ambition and formidable presence, understood the gravity of the situation. An insult to his brother was an insult to his family, and more importantly, an affront to the collective honor of all Achaean kings. The oath, he knew, was not merely a formality. It was the very bedrock of their aristocratic society, a sacred bond that, if broken, would undermine their entire system of alliances and mutual defense. He called for a great assembly, a gathering of kings and chieftains from across the Hellenic world to convene at Aulis, a sheltered bay on the eastern coast of Boeotia. The response was overwhelming. From every corner of Greece, ships began to gather, their sails billowing like white clouds against the azure sky. Warriors, clad in bronze and leather, their shields emblazoned with intricate designs, poured into Aulis. The air thrummed with anticipation. The class. Half of armor, the shouts of men, and the neighing of horses. It was an unprecedented mobilization, a spectacle that would have surely filled the hearts of onlookers with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The sheer scale of the undertaking was immense. According to Homer's Iliad, a detailed catalogue of ships lists over 1,000 vessels, carrying tens of thousands of warriors, a truly staggering number for the Bronze Age. While modern historians often debate the exact figures, suggesting they might be poetic exaggerations, the core truth of a massive, unified expedition remains. Among the arriving heroes, one figure stood out, not for his presence, but for his absence. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, the son of the sea nymph Thetis and King Peleus. His mother, knowing of a prophecy that foretold her son's death if he fought at Troy, had hidden him away on the island of Scyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. But Odysseus, with his famed cunning, was not easily fooled. He arrived at Scyros disguised as a merchant, laying out an array of trinkets and weapons. While the girls gravitated towards the jewelry, one girl, Achilles, instinctively reached for the sword and shield. His true identity revealed, Achilles, driven by destiny and the allure of eternal glory, agreed to join the expedition. His decision, though fated, was a testament to the powerful draw of honor and the inescapable call of war in that heroic age. Another key figure whose presence was crucial, yet initially reluctant, was Odysseus himself. The oracle had foretold that if he went to Troy, he would not return for 20 years. To avoid this grim prophecy, he feigned madness, ploughing his fields with an ox and a donkey yoked together, sowing salt instead of seeds. But Palamedes, another shrewd Achaean leader, saw through the ruse. He placed Odysseus's infant son, Telemachus, in the path of the plough. Odysseus, unable to harm his child, swerved the plough, revealing his sanity and sealing his fate to join the expedition. This episode, though not directly from Homer, is a well-known part of the broader Trojan War cycle, illustrating the lengths to which heroes would go to avoid their destinies, and the even greater forces that ultimately compelled them. As the fleet gathered, a new challenge emerged. The winds, which had once been favourable, now refused to blow. The ships lay becalmed in the harbour of Aulis, their sails limp, their crews growing restless. Days turned into weeks, and the Achaean leaders, their patience wearing thin, sought divine counsel. The seer Calchas, a prophet renowned for his ability to interpret the will of the gods, delivered a grim message. The goddess Artemis was displeased. Agamemnon, in a moment of hubris, had boasted that his hunting skills surpassed even hers, or perhaps he had killed a sacred deer in her grove. To appease the enraged goddess and secure favourable winds for their journey, a terrible sacrifice was demanded: Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. The king was torn. The agony of the choice was immense. Sacrifice his beloved child, or abandon the entire expedition, forever shaming himself and his brother and breaking the sacred oath. After much internal struggle and under immense pressure from the other kings, who believed the success of the expedition outweighed any personal tragedy, Agamemnon made the agonizing decision. Iphigenia was lured to Aulis under the pretense of marrying Achilles. Just as the knife was about to descend, some versions of the myth claim Artemis, taking pity on the innocent girl, replaced her with a deer, and spirited Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess in Tauris. Other versions, however, maintain that the sacrifice was indeed carried out, a stark reminder of the brutal demands of divine will and the harsh realities of power in the ancient world. Regardless of her ultimate fate, the incident left an indelible mark on Agamemnon and his family, a dark seed of resentment that would later blossom into further tragedy upon his return from Troy. With Artemis appeased, the winds finally stirred, the sails unfurled, catching the breeze, and the 1,000 ships, a veritable forest of masts, began to move. The sight must have been magnificent, awe-inspiring, and terrifying all at once. The bronze prows, often adorned with painted eyes, cut through the waves, churning the sea into a frothy white. The rhythmic beat of oars, the shouts of the rowers, and the creak of the timbers filled the air. This was not merely a punitive expedition. It was a grand undertaking, a testament to the collective power and ambition of the Achaean kings. Their destination, Troy, a city renowned for its formidable walls, its wealth, and its powerful allies. Troy, or Ilion as it was also known, stood proudly on a strategic hill overlooking the Hellespont, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara. For centuries, it had controlled vital trade routes, accumulating immense riches and developing into a thriving metropolis. Its defences were legendary. built, according to myth, with the aid of the gods Poseidon and Apollo. The city was ringed by massive stone walls, so thick and high that they seemed to defy attack. Inside, King Priam, a venerable monarch, ruled over a large and prosperous kingdom, supported by a vast network of allies from across Anatolia. The Trojans, though they knew of Helen's departure, likely underestimated the scale of the Achaean response. They probably viewed it as a raiding party, a common occurrence in that turbulent age, perhaps even a localized conflict that would quickly resolve. They could not have envisioned the unified might of the entire Greek world descending upon their shores. The abduction of Helen, a single act of passion or folly, had ignited a powder keg of honor, vengeance, and ambition, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of history and inspire countless tales for millennia to come. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the greatest war of the ancient world was about to begin. The sea, once a pathway for love and escape, now carried the heavy burden of 1,000 ships, each one a vessel of impending doom for the fabled city of Troy. The Aegean, once a friend, now churned with the fury of 1,000 ships, their bellies heavy with the hopes and fears of a united Greece. The journey to Troy had been long, fraught with false starts and divine interventions, but at last the vast armada, a shimmering crescent on the horizon, cast its shadow upon the shores of the Troad. The air, thick with salt and anticipation, hummed with the energy of men who had journeyed far for vengeance and glory. From the decks of their vessels, the Achaeans, as the Greeks were then known, gazed upon their objective, the formidable city of Troy. It was a sight that must have stolen their breath, a city not merely built, but seemingly grown from the very earth, its walls rising like an impossible dream against the azure sky. These were no ordinary fortifications. The poets would later sing of them as being crafted by the gods themselves, by Poseidon and Apollo, a testament to their strength and the divine favor they once enjoyed. Indeed, archaeological findings at Hisarlik, the likely site of ancient Troy, reveal layers upon layers of settlements, each built upon the ruins of the last, suggesting a city of immense antiquity and resilience, its defenses evolving over millennia. The walls of Troy 6 and 7a, the layers most commonly associated with the Trojan War, were particularly impressive, constructed of massive limestone blocks, rising in places to an estimated 10 meters, topped with sun-dried brick and punctuated by mighty towers. To the Achaean warriors, these walls must have appeared impregnable, a silent, stony challenge to their resolve. As the ships beached on the sandy shores, a ripple of unease, perhaps even dread, ran through the ranks. This was not to be a swift conquest, a quick raid for plunder and a captured queen. This was to be a siege, a grinding war of attrition against a city that seemed to defy the very notion of surrender. The initial landings were chaotic, a surge of men and equipment spilling onto the unfamiliar beach. The Trojans, not caught entirely unawares, met them with a fierce defense, their archers raining down arrows from the heights, their spears flashing in the sun. This first bloody encounter set the tone for the long years to come, a testament to Trojan courage and the brutal realities of ancient warfare. Among the first to fall, according to some accounts, was Patroclus, a brave Achaean warrior from Phylace, who, despite an oracle warning that the first to land would die, leaped ashore with unwavering courage. His death, a grim harbinger, underscored the immense cost of this enterprise. Yet his sacrifice also ignited a fierce resolve in his comrades. a grim determination to honor his memory and press forward. The Achaean camp quickly took shape on the plains before the city, a sprawling canvas of tents and makeshift shelters, a temporary home for a vast army far from their own hearths. They dug trenches, erected palisades, and established supply lines, transforming the peaceful landscape into a theatre of war. The Trojans, for their part, were not idle. Under the leadership of Hector, their greatest champion, they sallied forth from their gates, engaging the invaders in a series of skirmishes and pitched battles. These early clashes were crucial, allowing both sides to gauge the strength and tactics of their adversaries, to identify their champions and their weaknesses. One such early engagement involved the formidable Achaean hero, Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, a towering figure of immense strength and courage. He was said to be second only to Achilles in prowess. A bulwark against the Trojan onslaught. In one notable encounter, he faced Hector in single combat, a duel that raged for an entire day, neither man able to gain a decisive advantage. The fight, a spectacle of clashing bronze and straining muscle, was eventually called off by heralds as night fell, a mutual respect, perhaps, born between these two mighty warriors. This kin, dead of single combat, often recounted in epic poetry, served not only to showcase individual heroism, but also to raise the morale of the respective armies. A dramatic pause in the larger, more grinding conflict. Another key figure in these early days was Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca. While not possessing the raw strength of an Ajax or the swiftness of an Achilles, Odysseus's intelligence and strategic mind were invaluable. He was the architect of many a clever stratagem, always seeking an advantage, always thinking several steps ahead. It was Odysseus, for instance, who was instrumental in bringing Achilles to Troy, after the hero had initially hidden himself to avoid the war. His persuasive words and sharp intellect were as potent a weapon as any sword. The Achaean forces, though vast, were not without their internal struggles. The diverse collection of kings and chieftains, each with their own retinues and agendas, often led to disagreements and rivalries. Agamemnon, the High King, struggled to maintain unity and command over such a disparate host. His leadership, at times arrogant and self-serving, would prove to be a source of much friction throughout the war, particularly in his strained relationship with Achilles. The Trojans too faced their own challenges. While united in their defense of their homeland, they relied heavily on their allies from neighboring regions, who came to their aid in varying degrees of commitment. The city itself, though well provisioned for a siege, would eventually feel the pinch of prolonged isolation. Yet their morale, fueled by a fierce love for their city and families, remained high. They fought not for conquest, but for survival. One of the more intriguing, lesser-known aspects of the early siege concerns the fate of the surrounding countryside. While the Achaeans focused on the city itself, they also conducted raids into the fertile lands of the Troad and beyond, seeking provisions, plunder, and to weaken Troy's allies. These smaller campaigns, often overlooked in the grand narrative of the siege, were vital for sustaining the massive Achaean army. They captured smaller towns, seized livestock, and gathered supplies, effectively turning the region into their larder. It was during one such raid, for instance, that Achilles captured Briseis, a priestess who would later become a central figure in his famous quarrel with Agamemnon, a dispute that would have profound consequences for the Achaean war effort. The early years of the siege were a period of intense attrition, a slow, grinding war of raids, skirmishes, and attempts to breach the formidable walls. The Achaeans tried various tactics, from direct assault to sapping, but the Trojan defences held firm. The sheer scale of the conflict, with thousands of men engaged in daily combat, must have been a terrifying spectacle. The air would have been filled with the clang of bronze, the shouts of warriors, and the cries of the wounded. Dust, blood, and the metallic tang of battle would have permeated everything. Historians still debate the exact duration of the Trojan War. While Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, focuses on a few weeks in the 10th year of the conflict. The traditional narrative speaks of a 10-year siege. Archaeological evidence, while not definitively proving a 10-year war, does suggest a prolonged period of conflict and destruction at the site of Troy. The layers of burning and rebuilding, the signs of violent destruction, particularly in the Troy 6H and 7A layers, point to a city that endured significant warfare. Was it truly 10 years, or is that a poetic exaggeration designed to emphasize the epic scale of the struggle? Yeah, a feat that would challenge even modern military powers. The Achaeans, for all their strength, found themselves in a stalemate. The walls of Troy, silent and unyielding, seemed to mock their efforts. The city, nestled securely behind its defences, continued to resist. Yet, within those walls, the Trojans too were enduring immense hardship. The constant threat of attack, the loss of loved ones, and the ever-present shadow of war must have weighed heavily on their hearts. The scent of wood smoke from their hearths mingled with the acrid smell of battle, a poignant reminder of the life they were fighting to protect. The early skirmishes, the clashing of heroes, and the relentless defense of the city all served to harden both sides. The Achaeans, initially driven by a thirst for vengeance and glory, now fought with a grim determination born of prolonged struggle. The Trojans, defending their homes and families, fought with a desperate courage that only those facing annihilation can truly know. The stage was set for the epic confrontations that would define the war, for the moments of heroism and tragedy that would echo through the ages. The walls of Troy, silent witnesses to these initial struggles, held their secrets close, biding their time, waiting for the cunning that would eventually unravel their formidable strength. The air within the Achaean camp, once thick with the scent of sea salt and anticipation, now hung heavy with something far more acrid: discord. The spoils of war, meant to unify and reward, had instead become a poisoned chalice. For 9 long years, the Achaeans had campaigned across the Troad, sacking smaller cities and accumulating treasures. But Troy itself remained unyielding. Their latest conquest, the city of Thebe, had yielded a rich bounty. And among the captives were 2 women of noble birth: Chryseis, daughter of Apollo's priest, and Briseis, a queen from Lyrnessus. Agamemnon, the High King, had claimed Chryseis for himself, a prize befitting his station. Achilles, the swift-footed, the greatest warrior among them, had been awarded Briseis. But the priest of Apollo, a man named Chryses, came to the Achaean camp, his hands laden with gifts, his heart full of a father's plea. He sought to ransom his daughter, Chryseis, begging Agamemnon to release her. The Achaean soldiers, witnessing the old man's sorrow, urged their king to accept the generous offer. Yet Agamemnon, blinded by arrogance and a king's prerogative, refused, dismissing Chryses with harsh words and threats. He sent the old man away, his plea unheard, his daughter still captive. Chryses, his heart broken and his spirit wounded, walked away from the Achaean ships and prayed to his patron god, Apollo. And Apollo, the archer god, heard his priests lament. A terrible plague descended upon the Achaean camp. For 9 days, the funeral pyres burned ceaselessly, the air thick with the smoke of death. Men fell ill, their bodies racked with fever, their spirits consumed by despair. The arrows of Apollo, though unseen, struck true, felling warrior and common soldier alike. On the 10th day, Achilles, witnessing the devastation, called an assembly. He urged the prophet Calchas, a seer whose words were guided by the gods, to reveal the cause of Apollo's wrath. Calchas, with great trepidation, for he knew the king's temper, finally spoke. He declared that Apollo's fury was a direct consequence of Agamemnon's disrespect towards his priest and his refusal to release Chryseis. The only way to appease the god, Calchas stated, was to return Chryseis to her father without ransom and offer a hecatomb, a sacrifice of 100 oxen, to Apollo. Agamemnon, his face contorted with rage, accused Calchas of always prophesying ill, of being a prophet of doom. He railed against the demand, feeling his authority challenged, his pride wounded. He declared that he would release Chryseis, but only if he were given another prize in return, one that would compensate him for his loss. His eyes, burning with resentment, settled upon Achilles. He demanded Briseis, Achilles' own war prize. Achilles, his blood boiling, could barely contain his fury. He had fought tirelessly, faced down countless foes, and endured the hardships of war, all for the glory of the Achaean cause. And now, his hard-won prize, a woman he had come to cherish, was to be stripped from him by the very man he served. He threatened to withdraw from the war, to take his Myrmidons, his loyal warriors, and sail home to Phthia. He reminded Agamemnon that he had no personal quarrel with the Trojans. He fought for Agamemnon's honor, for Menelaus's stolen wife. The argument escalated, their voices echoing across the assembly, shattering the fragile unity of the Achaean leadership. Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, tried to mediate, his words a balm of ancient wisdom, urging compromise and respect for both men. But their tempers had flared too high. Agamemnon, in a final act of defiance and assertion of his royal power, sent his heralds, Talthybius and Eurybates, to Achilles' tent to seize Briseis. Achilles, his heart heavy with grief and his spirit consumed by indignation, did not resist. He allowed Briseis to be led away, his eyes filled with unshed tears. He then retreated to his tent, accompanied by his loyal companion, Patroclus, and wept. He called upon his divine mother, Thetis, a goddess of the sea, and poured out his heart to her, recounting Agamemnon's insult. Thetis, hearing her son's anguish, ascended from the depths of the sea and promised to intercede on his behalf with Zeus, the king of the gods. She would ask Zeus to ensure that the Achaeans suffered defeat in battle until Agamemnon recognized Achilles' worth and begged for his return. And so Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Achaeans, withdrew from the fighting. His Myrmidons, a formidable fighting force, also laid down their arms, their spears silent, their shields gathering dust. The consequences of this quarrel were immediate and devastating. Without Achilles' unparalleled prowess on the battlefield, the tide of war began to turn decisively in Troy's favor. The Trojans, emboldened by the absence of their most feared adversary, launched fierce assaults. Hector, the champion of Troy, led his forces with renewed vigor. The Achaeans, once confident in their numerical superiority and the strength of their heroes, now found themselves on the defensive, pushed back towards their ships. The plain before Troy, once a scene of Achaean dominance, became a perilous landscape where Trojan chariots thundered and Trojan spears found their mark with increasing frequency. Day after day, the Achaeans suffered heavy losses. The cries of the wounded filled the air, and the laments of the living mingled with the groans of the dying. Great heroes, like Diomedes, though still fighting valiantly, could not stem the tide alone. The Achaean wall, built to protect their ships, was breached. The Trojans, led by Hector, even managed to set fire to some of the Achaean ships, threatening to cut off their escape and doom them all. This was a moment of profound crisis for the Achaeans, a turning point where their very survival hung in the balance. Historians still debate the precise socio-political structures of the Mycenaean world that would have allowed such a public challenge to a king's authority, even from a powerful vassal like Achilles. Was it a reflection of a more decentralized power structure, or simply the extraordinary personal prestige of Achilles that allowed him to defy Agamemnon with such impunity? The archaeological record, rich in palatial remains and intricate administrative tablets, suggests a highly centralized system. Yet the epic narrative paints a picture of powerful individual heroes whose loyalty was not always absolute. Perhaps the oral tradition through which these stories were passed down for centuries before being written amplified the individual heroics and personal conflicts, giving them a prominence that might have been less pronounced in the rigid hierarchies of the Bronze Age. The Achaean leaders, witnessing the escalating disaster, realized the gravity of their mistake. Agamemnon, humbled by the mounting casualties and the imminent threat of total defeat, finally acknowledged his error. He called an assembly and, with a heavy heart, admitted his folly. He offered Achilles a lavish array of gifts: 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 gleaming cauldrons, 12 prize-winning horses, 7 skilled women from Lesbos, and the promise of 7 more cities to rule, along with Briseis herself, returned untouched, and a solemn oath that he had never lain with her. He even offered one of his own daughters in marriage, with a dowry beyond compare. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, and Ajax, the mighty warrior, along with Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor, were sent as envoys to Achilles' tent, bearing Agamemnon's plea and his magnificent gifts. They found Achilles playing the lyre, singing of the deeds of heroes, with Patroclus by his side. They presented Agamemnon's offer, detailing the vast wealth and power that awaited him if he would only return to the fight. But Achilles, his pride still deeply wounded, refused. His anger, it seemed, ran deeper than any material compensation could assuage. He spoke of the futility of war, of the fleeting nature of glory. He argued that he had risked his life countless times, only to be dishonored by his king. He recounted the prophecy that he had 2 fates: a long life without glory, or a short life filled with eternal renown. He declared that he preferred to return home to Phthia, to live a long and peaceful life, even if it meant abandoning the war and its promise of everlasting fame. He urged the envoys to consider their own homes, to abandon the fruitless siege and sail back to Greece. This refusal, a moment of profound psychological depth in the narrative, highlights a lesser-known aspect of ancient heroic ethos. The personal honor of a warrior could at times supersede even the collective good of the army or the demands of a king. It wasn't merely about the woman Briseis, but the public humiliation, the stripping away of his earned prestige. The fact that Agamemnon, the High King, had to send such an elaborate embassy and offer such extravagant reparations underscores the unique position Achilles held within the Achaean hierarchy. The envoys returned to Agamemnon, their mission a failure. Despair settled over the Achaean camp like a shroud. The Trojans, meanwhile, continued their relentless assault, pushing the Achaeans further back, closer to their ships. The fires on the Achaean vessels grew larger, threatening to consume their entire fleet. The roar of battle, once a distant hum, now vibrated through the very ground beneath their feet. It was in this moment of utter desperation that Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, could no longer bear to watch his comrades suffer. His heart ached for the Achaeans, for the men he had fought alongside for so many years. He approached Achilles, his eyes filled with tears, and begged him to return to the fight, or at least to allow him to wear Achilles' armor, to lead the Myrmidons into battle, hoping that the sight of the fearsome armor would strike fear into the Trojans and turn the tide. Achilles, though still resolute in his refusal to fight himself, was moved by Patroclus's plea and the dire situation of his countrymen. He agreed, but with a crucial condition. Patroclus was only to drive the Trojans away from the ships and prevent their destruction. He was not to pursue them further onto the plain, lest he provoke Apollo's wrath or risk his own life against the might of Hector. He lent Patroclus his magnificent armor, the very armor forged by Hephaestus, a dazzling, terrifying sight. He rallied the Myrmidons, ordering them to follow Patroclus into battle. As Patroclus, clad in Achilles' gleaming armor, led the Myrmidons onto the battlefield, a gasp went through the Trojan ranks. They believed Achilles himself had returned. Panic rippled through their lines, and for a brief, glorious period, the tide of battle turned once more. Patroclus fought with incredible ferocity, driving the Trojans back from the ships, extinguishing the fires, and pushing them across the plain. He killed many Trojan heroes, his spear a blur of motion, his courage boundless. He even slew Sarpedon, a son of Zeus and a mighty Trojan ally, a feat that further demoralized the Trojans. But in his zeal, Patroclus forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the fleeing Trojans, pushing them back towards the city walls, his ambition overriding caution. Apollo, still angered by the Achaeans, intervened, striking Patroclus from behind, disorienting him and knocking his helmet from his head. Hector, seeing his opportunity, seized it. He faced Patroclus and with a thrust of his spear, struck him down. The death of Patroclus sent a shockwave through both armies. For the Achaeans, it was a profound loss, a blow that eclipsed all previous defeats. For Achilles, the news was utterly devastating. When Antilochus, Nestor's son, brought him the terrible tidings, Achilles collapsed in grief, tearing at his hair, covering himself in dust. His roar of anguish echoed across the plain, reaching even the ears of his divine mother, Thetis, in the depths of the sea. The loss of Patroclus, his dearest companion, transformed Achilles' grief into a consuming, unquenchable rage. His earlier refusal to fight, born of wounded pride, now seemed insignificant. The world had shifted on its axis. He no longer cared for Agamemnon's gifts, for honor, or for a long life. All he desired was vengeance. He swore to kill Hector, no matter the cost, even if it meant his own death would follow soon after. This profound personal loss, a common thread in many heroic narratives, serves as the catalyst for Achilles' return to the war. The scholarly dispute here often centers on the nature of Achilles' grief and its portrayal. Was it a pure, selfless love for Patroclus? Or was it also intertwined with a sense of personal failure and the violation of his own code of honor, in that he had allowed his friend to die in his place? The ancient Greek concept of philia, a deep bond of affection, was complex, encompassing friendship, loyalty, and even a form of familial love. The intensity of Achilles' reaction suggests a bond that transcended typical camaraderie, hinting at a relationship often interpreted as the deepest form of love. Thetis, seeing her son's despair and his renewed, terrifying resolve, went to Hephaestus, the divine smith, and begged him to forge new armor for Achilles, armor even more magnificent than the one Patroclus had worn. And Hephaestus, in his celestial forge, crafted a shield of unparalleled beauty and intricacy, depicting scenes of cosmic order and human life, a breastplate that gleamed like fire, a helmet adorned with gold, and greaves of shining tin. Clad in this divine armor, Achilles was a sight to behold, a figure of terrifying beauty and unbridled fury. His return to battle was not merely the return of a warrior, it was the unleashing of a force of nature. His rage, cold and focused, was directed solely at Hector. The very air seemed to crackle with his presence. The Achaean camp, which had been steeped in despair, now buzzed with a renewed, albeit fearful, hope. The Trojans, who had revelled in their recent victories, felt a chill of dread as the news spread. Achilles had returned, and he sought vengeance, which had been a struggle for territory and honor, had now become a deeply personal vendetta, destined to culminate in a clash of titans. As the Achaeans reeled from their internal strife, their greatest warrior sulking in his tent, the tide of battle began to turn with a chilling inevitability. The absence of Achilles, a void that had once seemed impossible to fill, emboldened the Trojan forces. Their spirits, long dampened by the relentless Achaean onslaught, soared anew, fueled by the sight of the mighty Myrmidons idle on the sidelines. It was in this shifting landscape that Hector, son of Priam, truly came into his own. He was not merely a prince, but the very embodiment of Trojan resilience, a shield for his people, a spear against their foes. Hector's presence on the battlefield was a whirlwind of bronze and fury. His helmet, with its gleaming horsehair crest, became a beacon of hope for Troy and a harbinger of doom for the Achaeans. He moved with a grace that belied his strength, his spear finding its mark with deadly precision. The Achaean lines, once so formidable, now faltered and broke before his charge. He cut down warrior after warrior, his voice echoing across the plain, a rallying cry for his countrymen. The air thrummed with the clash of bronze, the shouts of men, and the desperate pleas of the wounded. But above it all, Hector's presence dominated. The Achaeans, leaderless in spirit without Achilles, found themselves pushed back, step by agonizing step. The walls of their camp, once a symbol of their unwavering resolve, now seemed a fragile barrier against the surging Trojan tide. Hector, with a ferocity born of desperation and love for his city, led his men to the very ships, the vessels that had carried the Achaeans across the wine-dark sea, now threatened with destruction. It was a sight that struck terror into the hearts of even the most seasoned Achaean warriors. The thought of being stranded, their escape cut off, was a nightmare made real. Among the Achaean ranks, a deep unease settled. The leaders, Agamemnon, Odysseus, and Ajax, fought with valor, but even their combined strength seemed insufficient to stem the tide. They looked towards the Achilles' tent, a silent plea in their eyes, a desperate hope that he would relent, that his wrath against Agamemnon would finally yield to his loyalty to his comrades. But Achilles remained steadfast in his refusal, his heart hardened by the perceived insult, his anger a storm within him. It was during these desperate days that Patroclus, Achilles' dearest companion, could no longer bear to watch the suffering of his people. His heart, tender and compassionate, a stark contrast to Achilles' fiery pride, was torn by the sight of the Achaean dead and wounded. He saw the ships burning, the very lifeline of their expedition, and a profound sense of urgency gripped him. He approached Achilles, his voice pleading, his eyes filled with a sorrow that Achilles could not ignore. He begged Achilles to return to battle, or failing that, to allow him to don Achilles' armour, to lead the Myrmidons into the fray, to strike fear into the Trojans, and give the Achaeans a moment of respite. Achilles, though still consumed by his rage, could not deny Patroclus. Perhaps a flicker of his old camaraderie, a memory of their shared youth, softened his resolve. He agreed, but with a stern warning. Patroclus was to drive the Trojans back from the ships, but no further. He was not to pursue them to the walls of Troy, for fear of incurring the wrath of the gods, or worse, of meeting Hector in single combat. It was a moment laden with unspoken dread, a premonition of tragedy that hung heavy in the air. And so, Patroclus, clad in the gleaming armour of Achilles, a panoply that shimmered with the aura of its true owner, emerged from the Myrmidon tents. The sight of him, or rather, the sight of Achilles' armour, sent a ripple of fear through the Trojan ranks. They believed Achilles had returned, and for a moment, the tide of battle turned once more. The Trojans, who had been on the verge of victory, faltered, their momentum broken. The sudden appearance of what they believed to be their most formidable foe. Patroclus, fueled by a righteous anger and a desperate hope, fought with a ferocity that surprised even the most seasoned warriors. He cut down many Trojans, his spear a blur of bronze, his cries echoing Achilles' own. He pushed them back from the ships, extinguishing the flames, and drove them across the plain. The Achaeans, seeing their fortunes reversed, rallied behind him, their spirits renewed. It was a glorious, if fleeting, moment of triumph. But Patroclus, carried away by the heat of battle, and perhaps by a surge of hubris, forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the retreating Trojans, driving them closer and closer to the very walls of Troy, a boundary Achilles had explicitly forbidden him to cross. He slew Sarpedon, a son of Zeus and a brave Lycian warrior, a deed that drew the attention and ire of the gods. The fates, those unseen weavers of destiny, began to tighten their threads around him. The climax of this desperate struggle came when Patroclus faced Hector. The two champions, one cloaked in borrowed glory, the other radiating the genuine strength of his own spirit, met in a clash that would forever alter the course of the war. Hector, recognizing that the figure before him was not Achilles, but Patroclus, fought with renewed vigor. He saw an opportunity to not only reclaim the lost ground, but to strike a devastating blow against the Achaeans. The battle between Patroclus and Hector was fierce and prolonged. Patroclus, though brave, was not Achilles. He lacked the divine protection, the sheer unyielding power that made Achilles almost invincible. As the fight raged, the god Apollo, ever watchful over Troy, intervened. He struck Patroclus from behind, disorienting him, loosening his armor, and leaving him vulnerable. Then Euphorbus, a young Trojan warrior, wounded Patroclus with a spear. Finally, Hector, seizing the moment, delivered the fatal blow, his spear piercing Patroclus's flesh. The death of Patroclus was a moment of profound tragedy, a turning point in the Trojan War. The Achaean forces, who had just begun to hope, were plunged back into despair. The very armor of Achilles, now stained with Patroclus's blood, was stripped from his body by Hector, a trophy of his victory. The battle then raged over Patroclus's body, the Achaeans desperate to reclaim their fallen comrade, the Trojans equally determined to desecrate him. Menelaus and Ajax fought valiantly to protect the corpse, eventually succeeding in carrying it back to the Achaean camp, a somber procession of grief and defeat. The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles through Antilochus, Nestor's son, and it shattered him. His grief was immediate, overwhelming, and absolute. He tore at his hair, covered himself in ash, and cried out with such anguish that his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, heard him from the depths of the ocean. All his previous anger, his pride, his resentment towards Agamemnon, vanished in the face of this immense personal loss. The man he had loved more than any other, his companion since childhood, was gone, and Achilles felt as though a part of himself had died with him. Thetis, seeing her son's profound sorrow, ascended from the sea to comfort him. Achilles, consumed by a thirst for vengeance, declared his intention to return to battle, to kill Hector, no matter the cost, even if it meant his own death, which his mother had long prophesied would follow closely on Hector's. Thetis, knowing the grim prophecy, agreed to help him, promising to acquire new divinely forged armor from Hephaestus, the smith god, since his old armor had been taken by Hector. While Thetis journeyed to Olympus, Achilles, though unarmed, made his presence known. He stood at the trench, his voice amplified by the goddess Athena, a terrifying roar that struck fear into the hearts of the Trojans. The sheer force of his grief and rage emanating from the man who had been absent for so long caused the Trojans to recoil, giving the Achaeans a chance to retrieve Patroclus's body. The next morning, Thetis returned with the new armor, crafted by Hephaestus himself. It was a masterpiece of divine artistry, gleaming with celestial light, adorned with intricate scenes of life and cosmos. The shield, in particular, was a marvel, depicting the earth, sky, and sea, cities at war and at peace, fields being ploughed, and dances being performed. It was a microcosm of the world, a stark contrast to the singular focus of vengeance that now consumed Achilles. Clad in this magnificent, divinely wrought armor, Achilles was transformed. He was no longer the sulking warrior, but an avenging god, his eyes burning with an unholy fire. He reconciled with Agamemnon, accepting the gifts and the apology, though the past grievances now seemed trivial in the face of his overwhelming sorrow and desire for revenge. His focus was singular, his purpose clear. Hector must die. The Achaean forces, witnessing the return of their greatest warrior, felt a surge of hope and dread. Hope, because Achilles' presence alone was worth 1,000 men. Dread, because they knew the terrible price that would be paid. The battle that followed was not merely a clash of armies, but a hunt, a relentless pursuit by a warrior driven by a grief so profound it bordered on madness. Achilles plunged into the Trojan ranks, a whirlwind of destruction. His new spear, heavy and true, found its mark again and again. The river Scamander, choked with the bodies of the slain, rose in protest against him, its waters turning red with blood. Achilles, in his fury, even fought against the river god, a testament to his almost divine rage. The Trojans scattered before him, their courage broken, their hope extinguished. Historians still debate the precise psychological impact of Achilles' absence and return on both sides of the conflict. Was it purely the physical presence of the warrior, or was it the symbolic weight of his withdrawal and subsequent re-engagement that truly shifted the morale? Some argue that the Trojans, having tasted victory in his absence, felt a deeper despair upon his return, a sense of having their hard-won gains snatched away. Others suggest that the Achaeans, having endured such hardship without him, fought with a renewed ferocity born of relief and vengeance. The lesser-known detail often overlooked in the grand narrative is the specific role of the Myrmidons during Patroclus's brief triumph. While they were known as Achilles' elite troops, their initial reluctance to engage without their leader and their subsequent surge of renewed spirit under Patroclus highlights the profound bond of loyalty and fear that Achilles commanded. Their actions, though overshadowed by Patroclus's individual glory, were crucial in pushing back the Trojan assault on the ships. The stage was set for the inevitable confrontation. Hector, despite the pleas of his parents, Priam and Hecuba, who begged him to remain within the safety of the city walls, chose to face Achilles. He stood before the Scaean gates, a lone figure, a final bulwark against the encroaching doom. He knew the prophecy, he knew his fate, but his honor, his duty to his city, would not allow him to flee. Perhaps these walls, which had witnessed so much joy and sorrow, whispered stories of courage to him in that final quiet moment before the storm. As Achilles approached, his armor gleaming, his face a mask of grief and fury, Hector felt a moment of fear. He turned and fled, circling the city walls 3 times. Pursued relentlessly by Achilles, the chase itself was a testament to the sheer terror Achilles inspired, a grim dance of fate played out before the eyes of gods and mortals alike. Finally, Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, tricked Hector into standing his ground, promising him aid. The final duel between Achilles and Hector was a clash of titans, a battle that would resonate through the ages. Hector, though brave, was outmatched. Achilles, driven by the memory of Patroclus, fought with a speed and strength that seemed inhuman. He knew the weak points of his own armor, having lent it to Patroclus, and he exploited them mercilessly. His spear found the vulnerable spot in Hector's neck, a place where the collarbone and throat met, a swift and fatal blow. With Hector fallen, the heart of Troy was broken. Achilles, in his grief-fueled rage, committed an act that even the gods found abhorrent. He stripped Hector of his armor, tied his body to his chariot, and dragged it 3 times around the walls of Troy, desecrating the corpse of his noble foe. It was a barbaric act, a testament to the depths of his despair and the consuming nature of his vengeance. The wails of Priam and Hecuba, watching from the walls, were a mournful echo of Troy's impending doom. The death of Hector, Troy's greatest champion, marked a profound shift in the war. It was not merely the loss of a warrior, but the loss of hope, the loss of a shield that had protected the city for so long. The Achaeans rejoiced, their spirits soaring, knowing that the greatest obstacle to their victory had been removed. For Troy, it was the beginning of the end, a precursor to the final, devastating act that would soon unfold. The air over the Trojan plain, once filled with the clamour of battle, now carried the heavy silence of impending doom. A silence broken only by the distant, mournful cries from within the city walls. The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles like a spear through the heart. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, found him weeping on the shore, a sound so profound it seemed to still the waves themselves. His grief was not quiet, but a roaring storm, shaking the very foundations of his being. He smeared dust over his face, tore at his hair, and cried out to the heavens, a lament that echoed across the Trojan plain, chilling the blood of both Achaeans and Trojans. Patroclus, his dearest companion, his soul's twin, was gone, and with him a part of Achilles himself. Thetis, seeing her son's unbearable sorrow, knew he would now return to battle, a path she had always dreaded, for it led inevitably to his own demise. Yet she could not deny him his vengeance. She promised him new armor, forged by the divine hands of Hephaestus himself. While she journeyed to Olympus, Achilles, still unarmed, stood at the trench, his mere presence a terrifying beacon. His voice, amplified by Athena, boomed across the battlefield, a primal roar that sent shivers of fear through the Trojan ranks, causing them to falter and retreat, allowing the Achaeans to recover Patroclus's body. The night that followed was a vigil of sorrow and preparation. The Achaeans mourned Patroclus, their grief mingling with the renewed terror of Achilles' return. On the Trojan side, panic began to set in. Polydamas, a wise counselor, urged Hector to withdraw the Trojan forces behind the city walls, arguing that Achilles' rage was now an unstoppable force. But Hector, emboldened by his recent victories, and perhaps swayed by a touch of hubris, refused. He believed they could face Achilles in the open field, a decision that would prove catastrophic. As dawn broke, a sight of breathtaking beauty and terrifying power descended from Olympus. Thetis arrived, bearing the magnificent armor crafted by Hephaestus. The shield, a masterpiece of divine artistry, depicted the cosmos, cities at peace and at war, fields and oceans. A miniature world reflecting the very life Achilles was about to risk. The helmet, breastplate, and greaves gleamed with an unearthly light. As Achilles donned the armor, he was transformed. No longer merely a man, but a god of war, radiant and terrible. His rage, bottled and festering, now erupted with unbridled fury. He gathered the Achaean forces, his eyes burning with an almost supernatural intensity. He publicly reconciled with Agamemnon, the cause of their earlier bitter quarrel now seeming trivial in the face of his immense loss. The past was forgotten, only vengeance remained. He drove his charioteer Automedon onto the battlefield, a whirlwind of destruction. The Trojans, who had dared to venture beyond their walls, were met with an onslaught unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Achilles cut through their ranks like a reaper through wheat, his spear finding its mark again and again. Rivers ran red with blood, and the air was filled with the cries of the dying. He pursued the fleeing Trojans relentlessly, driving them towards the Scamander River. Here, the slaughter became even more horrific. Achilles, in his frenzy, filled the river with so many bodies that its waters rose in protest, the river god himself, Xanthus, rising to confront him. A cosmic battle ensued, Achilles fighting against the very elements, a testament to his almost divine power and his boundless rage. He was only saved from being overwhelmed by the river god's wrath when Hephaestus intervened, sending flames to dry up the river and drive Xanthus back into his banks. This dramatic clash between a mortal and a deity, however brief, underscores the extraordinary nature of Achilles' rage and the cosmic scale of the Trojan War itself, where even gods took sides and intervened directly. As the Trojans streamed back towards the city, a desperate, terrified rout, only Hector remained outside the gates. His parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba, pleaded with him from the walls, their voices choked with tears, begging him to come inside to save himself. But Hector, burdened by his earlier refusal to retreat, and perhaps by a sense of duty to face the greatest of the Achaean warriors, stood his ground. He knew his fate was sealed, yet he would not flee. Achilles approached, his new armor blazing like a baleful star. Hector, despite his immense courage, felt a tremor of fear. He turned and fled, circling the city walls 3 times, with Achilles in relentless pursuit. It was a chase witnessed by gods and mortals alike, a desperate dance of fate. Some accounts suggest that Apollo, for a time, gave Hector a burst of speed to prolong the chase, perhaps to delay the inevitable, or simply to add to the dramatic tension of the confrontation. But eventually, Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, tricked him into stopping, convincing him that they would face Achilles together. When Hector realized he had been deceived, that he stood alone against the raging Achilles, he knew his end was near. Yet he faced it with dignity. He proposed a pact that the victor would return the loser's body for proper burial. Achilles, consumed by his grief and fury, scornfully refused. There could be no pacts between men and lions, he declared. The duel began. Hector hurled his spear, but it struck Achilles' new, divinely forged shield and was deflected. Achilles, in turn, cast his spear, and it pierced Hector's throat, a small, vulnerable spot in his armor. As Hector lay dying, he pleaded once more for his body to be returned to his family. Achilles, his heart hardened by sorrow, refused again, vowing to leave Hector's body for the dogs and vultures. With Hector dead, Achilles' rage, though momentarily sated, found a new, horrifying outlet. He stripped Hector of his armor, tied his body to his chariot by the ankles, and dragged him 3 times around the city walls, in full view of Priam, Hecuba, and the entire Trojan populace. The sight was agonizing, the profound desecration that broke the hearts of all who witnessed it. Priam wailed from the walls, the sound of pure anguish, as he watched his beloved son's body being defiled. This act of extreme vengeance, while understandable given Achilles' grief, was considered an affront to both human decency and divine law, a transgression that would have significant repercussions. Historians still debate the extent to which this act was a common practice in ancient warfare as a means of psychological warfare, or if it was uniquely extreme, even for the brutal standards of the time. Some scholars argue that while the stripping of armor was customary, the prolonged desecration of dragging the body was a deliberate narrative choice by Homer to emphasize Achilles' profound rage and the tragic consequences of unchecked emotion. For 12 days, Achilles continued to desecrate Hector's body, dragging it around Patroclus' tomb each morning. But the gods, particularly Apollo and Aphrodite, protected the corpse from decay and further mutilation. They were appalled by Achilles' actions and urged Zeus to intervene. The divine council, witnessing the suffering of Priam and the disrespect shown to the dead, decided it was time for Achilles' rage to subside. Zeus sent Iris, the messenger goddess, to Priam, instructing him to go to the Achaean camp and ransom his son's body. At the same time, Thetis was sent to Achilles, urging him to accept the ransom and release Hector's body. Under the cloak of night, guided by Hermes, Priam made his way to the Achaean camp, a frail old king venturing into the heart of his enemy's stronghold. He entered Achilles' tent, a scene of immense tension and potential danger. Priam knelt before Achilles, kissing the hands that had slain his son, a gesture of profound humility and desperation. He appealed to Achilles' own memories of his father, Peleus, reminding him of the love a father holds for his son. Achilles, witnessing Priam's grief, saw in the old king a reflection of his own sorrow, a shared humanity in the face of loss. The sight of Priam's tears and the reminder of his own aging father whom he would never see again finally broke through the wall of his hardened heart. His rage, which had burned so fiercely, began to ebb, replaced by a profound sadness and empathy. He wept with Priam, mourning Patroclus, and Priam wept for Hector, their shared grief bridging the chasm of war and hatred. This moment, often regarded as one of the most poignant in the entire epic, illustrates the capacity for compassion even in the most brutal of circumstances, and the universal nature of loss. Achilles accepted the ransom, a wagon laden with precious gifts. He personally lifted Hector's body, now cleansed and anointed by Achilles' own servants, onto the wagon. He granted Priam a 12-day truce for Hector's funeral, a period of peace amidst the relentless war. As Priam departed with his son's body, the weight of the war seemed momentarily lifted. Hector's funeral in Troy was a solemn and heartbreaking affair. For 9 days, the Trojans gathered wood for the pyre. On the 10th day, they cremated his body, and on the 11th, they gathered his bones, placed them in a golden urn, and buried it in a deep grave covered with large stones. The city mourned its greatest defender, its hope, its shield. With Hector gone, the Trojans knew their city's fate was sealed. The air hung heavy with a sense of impending doom, a quiet despair that settled over the city like a shroud. The funeral rites, meticulously described, highlight the deep cultural importance of honoring the dead, even in times of war, and the belief that a proper burial was essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. It was a final act of love and respect for a hero whose courage and devotion had been unwavering. Achilles' return to battle and his slaying of Hector was indeed a turning point. The Trojans had lost their most formidable warrior, their primary source of courage and strategic brilliance. Their morale plummeted, and the momentum of the war shifted decisively in favor of the Achaeans. While the war would continue for some time, and other heroes would rise and fall, the death of Hector marked the beginning of the end for Troy. The city, once seemingly impregnable, now stood vulnerable, its walls whispering not of defiance, but of sorrow and impending collapse. The shadow of Achilles, the swift-footed, the godlike, now loomed larger than ever over the doomed city. The siege, now a scar upon the land, deepened its hold, its relentless rhythm grinding away at both hope and defiance. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each sunrise bringing renewed skirmishes, each sunset casting long, weary shadows over the blood-soaked plains. The Achaeans, for all their might, found themselves ensnared in a war of attrition, their initial fervour dulled by endless struggle. And within the walls of Troy, the spirit of resistance, though battered, still flickered, fueled by a fierce pride and the desperate belief that their city, blessed by the gods, could not truly fall. Yet even the greatest heroes are mortal, and the fates, weaving their intricate tapestries, began to snip threads with chilling precision. Achilles, the swift-footed, the near-invincible, remained a whirlwind of destruction on the battlefield. His very presence could turn the tide of a skirmish. His war cry, a chilling wind that swept through the Trojan ranks. But even he, destined for a short, glorious life, could not escape the prophecy that had shadowed his birth. It was said that Apollo, still nursing a grudge from Achilles' sacrilege at his temple, guided the arrow. Paris, the prince who had ignited this inferno, loosed the shot, a seemingly innocuous missile amidst the chaos. But the arrow, imbued with divine purpose, found its mark. The one vulnerable spot on Achilles' otherwise invulnerable body, his heel. A collective gasp, a terrible silence seemed to fall over the battlefield as the greatest warrior of the Achaeans crumpled. The roar of battle dwindled to a horrified murmur, then a desperate scramble as the Achaeans rallied to retrieve his body, fighting off the surging Trojans who sought to desecrate their fallen nemesis. The loss of Achilles was a seismic shock, a blow that reverberated through the Achaean camp, plunging them into a profound grief that threatened to break their resolve. It was as if the sun itself had been extinguished, leaving them in a sudden, chilling twilight. The pall of Achilles' death hung heavy, but the war, relentless in its demands, continued. His magnificent armor, crafted by Hephaestus himself, became a new point of contention, a symbol of leadership and martial prowess. Two heroes, both formidable, laid claim to it: the cunning Odysseus, whose intellect had often steered the Achaean cause, and the mighty Ajax, son of Telamon, a bulwark in battle, second only to Achilles in strength and courage. The Achaean chieftains, recognizing the potential for internal strife, convened a council to decide. They heard arguments, weighed merits, and ultimately, by a majority vote, awarded the armor to Odysseus. The decision, though perhaps strategically sound, shattered Ajax. His pride, already immense, could not bear the perceived slight. He felt dishonored, his loyalty and courage unacknowledged. In the depths of his despair and rage, perhaps clouded by divine madness whispered by Athena, who favored Odysseus, Ajax suffered a terrible delusion. He mistook a flock of sheep for the Achaean leaders who had wronged him, and in a fit of madness slaughtered them. When dawn broke and the terrible truth of his actions dawned upon him, the shame was unbearable. He, the great Ajax, the shield of the Achaeans, had fallen so low. Rather than live with such dishonor, he fell upon his own sword, a tragic end for a hero whose strength of body was unmatched, but whose spirit could not endure such a wound to his honor. The loss of Ajax, following so closely on the heels of Achilles, was another devastating blow, a testament to the brutal toll the war was exacting on the Achaean leadership. The ranks of their greatest warriors were thinning, leaving a void that even their vast numbers could not easily fill. Amidst these mortal tragedies, the divine drama unfolded with ever-increasing intensity. The gods, far from being distant observers, were deeply, passionately embroiled in the conflict, their allegiances clear. Their interventions often decisive. Zeus, the king of the gods, attempted to maintain a semblance of neutrality, though his sympathies often wavered. Hera and Athena, fierce in their support of the Achaeans, continued to scheme and influence events, their eyes fixed on Troy's destruction. Aphrodite, ever protective of Paris and her beloved city, sought to shield her favored mortals, while Apollo and Ares, often aligned with the Trojans, lent their formidable power to the city's defense. There were moments when their presence was almost palpable, a shimmer in the air, a sudden gust of wind, an inexplicable surge of strength, or a crippling fear. When Diomedes, in a moment of audacious courage, wounded Aphrodite, her shriek of pain echoed through Olympus, a stark reminder that even gods could feel the sting of mortal weapons, albeit briefly. Later, he even dared to wound Ares, the very god of war, a feat that sent tremors through the divine assembly. These were not mere symbolic gestures. These were direct, physical interventions, turning the tide of battles, saving favored heroes from certain death, or conversely, guiding the fatal blow. One of the more fascinating, and perhaps disputed, aspects of the divine intervention was the extent to which the gods truly shaped mortal destiny versus merely nudging events. Some ancient accounts suggest a near-total control, with mortals as mere puppets dancing to divine whims. Yet others imply that the gods merely amplified existing human traits, courage, cowardice, cunning, or provided opportune moments, leaving the final choice to the mortals themselves. For instance, while it is often said that Apollo guided Paris's arrow to Achilles' heel, did he force Paris to shoot, or merely ensure the arrow found its mark once loosed? This nuanced distinction remains a point of scholarly debate, a puzzle woven into the very fabric of the ancient narratives. Did the gods truly preordain every step, or did they merely play a cosmic game of chess, influencing the board but allowing the pieces a degree of agency? Perhaps the answer lies in a blend of both, a tapestry where free will and divine decree are inextricably intertwined. The war's relentless toll began to weigh heavily on the Achaeans. Morale, already fragile after years of siege, plummeted with the deaths of their greatest champions. The Trojans, though also weary, found renewed hope in these significant victories, believing that the gods were finally turning in their favor. The Achaean leaders, particularly Odysseus, known for his sagacity and resourcefulness, understood that a direct assault on the formidable walls of Troy was proving futile. They needed a new strategy, something audacious, something that would bypass the impregnable defenses and the divine protection that seemed to envelop the city. It was Odysseus, the master of stratagem, who conceived of the plan that would ultimately decide the fate of Troy. The idea, whispered to him by Athena, or perhaps born from his own fertile mind, was audacious in its simplicity and brilliant in its deception. He proposed constructing a colossal wooden horse, an offering to Athena, ostensibly as a gift to atone for the desecration of her temple and the theft of the Palladium. This horse, they would claim, was too large to be brought within the city walls, and thus, if the Trojans brought it in, it would bring them divine favor. If they destroyed it, divine wrath would follow. The Achaean forces, after initial skepticism, embraced the plan with a renewed sense of purpose. They set about constructing the enormous effigy. Using timber from the sacred groves of Mount Ida, the sheer scale of the undertaking was immense, requiring the combined effort of their finest carpenters and engineers. The hollow belly of the horse was designed to conceal a hand-picked contingent of their elite warriors, led by Odysseus himself. Among them were Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, now a formidable warrior in his own right, and other brave Achaean heroes, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and grim determination. Once the horse was complete, a deceptive scene was meticulously staged. The entire Achaean fleet, under the cover of darkness, would sail away from the Trojan shore, disappearing behind the island of Tenedos, creating the illusion of a complete withdrawal. Only the giant wooden horse would be left behind, standing solitary on the plain, a silent, enigmatic monument. This elaborate ruse was designed to lull the Trojans into a false sense of security, to make them believe that after 10 long years, the Achaeans had finally given up, defeated and demoralized. The dawn that followed the Achaean withdrawal was unlike any the Trojans had known for a decade. The plains, usually teeming with enemy soldiers, were empty. The siege camps, once sprawling and vibrant, were deserted, their fires cold, their tents collapsed. Only the colossal wooden horse stood sentinel, a silent testament to the vanished enemy. At first, a cautious disbelief spread through the city. Could it be true? Had the long nightmare truly ended? Slowly, tentatively, the gates of Troy, which had been sealed for 10 years, creaked open. The people, emaciated and weary, poured out, their eyes wide with wonder and a dawning hope. They saw the abandoned camps, the empty beaches, and then the immense, silent horse. Confusion and debate erupted. Some, like the wise priest Laocoon, were deeply suspicious. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he famously cried, his voice echoing with desperate warning. He urged them to destroy the horse, to examine its contents, to trust no offering from their long-standing enemies. To prove his point, he thrust a spear into the horse's wooden flank. The hollow sound that resonated from within, a muffled clanking of armor, sent a shiver through some of the onlookers. But before his words could truly sway the crowd, a terrible sign from the gods intervened. 2 enormous sea serpents, sent by Poseidon, who favored the Achaeans, or perhaps was punishing Laocoon for some transgression, emerged from the waves and coiled around Laocoon and his 2 sons, crushing them in their terrifying embrace. The horrific spectacle was interpreted by the Trojans as divine wrath for Laocoon's sacrilege against the holy offering. It seemed the gods themselves had confirmed the horse's sacred nature. Adding to the deception, the Achaeans had left behind a single man, Sinon, a master of deceit. He was found by the Trojans, bound and seemingly abandoned. He spun a tale of woe, claiming he was a victim of Odysseus's treachery, left behind as a sacrifice to ensure a safe voyage home for the Achaean fleet. He then explained the purpose of the horse. It was an offering to Athena, made so large that the Trojans could not bring it into their city, thus preventing them from gaining Athena's favor. If they brought it inside, he claimed, Troy would become invincible. Sinon's cunning lies, combined with the apparent divine wrath against Laocoon, swayed the Trojan council, despite the desperate warnings of Cassandra, whose prophecies were always true but never believed. The Trojans decided to bring the wooden horse within their walls. It was a moment of profound irony and tragic triumph. The very people who had resisted for a decade, whose walls had stood unbreached, now willingly dismantled a section of their own defenses to bring in their destruction. With great effort, they dragged the massive wooden horse through the breach in their walls, celebrating their perceived victory with joyous feasting and revelry. The city, for the first time in 10 years, was filled not with the sounds of war, but with music, laughter, and the clinking of wine cups. They believed the war was over, that they had triumphed, and that peace had finally returned to Troy. As the stars emerged, casting their soft glow over the unsuspecting city, the sounds of celebration, it slowly faded, replaced by the deep, peaceful slumber of a people exhausted by war, and now, finally, at rest. But within the belly of the great wooden horse, the Achaean warriors waited, their hearts beating a silent, terrifying rhythm, poised to unleash the final, devastating act of the Trojan War. The siege had stretched on for a decade, its relentless rhythm etching itself into the very stones of Troy and the weary harps of the Achaeans. 10 long years of blood and dust, of fleeting victories and crushing losses, had worn thin the patience of even the most resolute warriors. The mighty walls of Ilion, built, some said, by the very gods themselves, had proven impregnable, defying every assault, every cunning tactic. Despair, a silent, creeping foe, began to whisper in the Achaean camp, threatening to unravel the fragile bonds of their alliance. Many a hero, their spirit dulled by the endless stalemate, yearned for the distant shores of home, for the scent of their own hearth fires rather than the acrid smoke of battle. It was amidst this pervasive weariness that Odysseus, the shrewd and resourceful king of Ithaca, a man whose mind was as intricate and winding as the labyrinth, conceived of a plan so audacious, so utterly unprecedented, that it seemed at first glance to be the product of madness. He had watched the Trojans, observed their piety, their deep reverence for the gods, and their unwavering belief in divine omens. He knew their pride, their unwavering conviction that Troy was favoured by Olympus. And in this knowledge, he found the key to their undoing. The idea, when he first presented it to the assembled Achaean leaders, must have sounded like a fantastical tale spun by a bard. A colossal wooden horse, crafted with such artistry and scale that it would appear to be a genuine offering to the gods, a gift of appeasement for the long and bloody war. But within its hollow belly, concealed in the oppressive darkness, would lie a hand-picked contingent of the Achaeans' finest warriors, their breaths held, their hearts pounding in unison. The rest of the Achaean army, their ships beached on the nearby shore, would fain retreat, setting sail under the cloak of night, leaving behind only this enigmatic wooden behemoth. The initial reactions were, predictably, a mixture of skepticism and awe. Agamemnon, the High King, known more for his martial prowess than his strategic brilliance, must have squinted, trying to reconcile the image of a giant wooden horse with the brutal realities of war. Ajax, the mighty, straightforward warrior, likely grumbled, preferring the direct clash of steel to such elaborate trickery. But Odysseus, with his persuasive tongue and keen intellect, patiently laid out every intricate detail, every contingency. He explained how the Trojans, seeing the Achaean fleet depart, would believe the war finally over, their prayers answered, their city saved. They would interpret the horse as a sign of Achaean surrender, a desperate plea for safe passage, or perhaps even a votive offering left behind to atone for their sacrilege. The construction of this monumental deception began immediately. Epeius, a master carpenter and craftsman, was tasked with the daunting undertaking. Day and night, under the watchful eyes of Odysseus and his most trusted lieutenants, the wood was felled, shaped, and joined. The sheer scale of the project was immense, requiring not just skill, but an almost artistic vision. They fashioned it from the fir trees of Mount Ida, their sturdy trunks transformed into ribs and planks. The horse grew, piece by painstaking piece, its wooden flanks rising higher and higher, its carved mane and tail flowing with a deceptive grace. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity, and a harbinger of doom. As the horse neared completion, the chosen warriors were selected. Odysseus himself, of course, would be among them, for who else could command such a perilous mission? Menelaus, the wronged husband, his desire for vengeance still burning bright, was also chosen. Others, known for their courage, their discipline, and their ability to endure the most claustrophobic conditions, stepped forward. Accounts vary on the exact number of men concealed within the horse, some ancient so, Researchers suggest as few as 30, while others claim as many as 50. Regardless of the precise figure, each man knew the immense risk they were undertaking. Their lives and the fate of the entire Achaean expedition rested on the success of this audacious gamble. Finally, the day came. The Achaean camp, once a bustling hive of activity, was dismantled. Tents were struck, supplies loaded, and the great fleet, hundreds of ships strong, prepared to set sail. But not truly. Under the cloak of darkness, they would merely sail to the nearby island of Tenedos, just out of sight of Troy, where they would lie in wait, their oars muffled, their sails furled, ready to return at a moment's notice. As the sun began to paint the eastern sky with hues of rose and gold, the Trojans, peering from their battlements, saw a sight that must have stirred a whirlwind of emotions within them. The vast Achaean camp, which had for so long been a constant, menacing presence on their plains, was gone, vanished. Only the colossal wooden horse remained, standing solitary and enigmatic, a silent sentinel on the deserted plain. A wave of joyous disbelief must have swept through the city. Shouts of triumph, long suppressed, erupted. The war was over. The Achaeans had finally given up. They had sailed away, defeated, leaving behind this strange, magnificent offering. The gates of Troy, which had remained firmly shut for a decade, were thrown open. The citizens, men, women, and children, streamed out, their faces alight with a mixture of relief, curiosity, and burgeoning celebration. They approached the horse with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Among them was Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, a man of wisdom and foresight. He looked upon the horse with a deep unease, his heart heavy with a premonition of disaster. "Trojans, do not trust this horse," he cried, his voice echoing across the plain. "Whatever it is, I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts." He suspected a trick, a hidden danger. In a desperate attempt to prove his point, he hurled his spear at the wooden flank of the horse. The spear struck with a dull thud, and some accounts say a faint groan emanated from within, though it was likely drowned out by the clamour of the crowd. But Laocoon's warning, though prescient, was tragically ignored. Just as he spoke, a group of Trojan shepherds dragged forward a bound man, an Achaean, who they had found hiding near the abandoned camp. This was Sinon, a master of deception, hand-picked by Odysseus for this crucial role. He was a cousin of Odysseus, and his acting skills were as sharp as any warrior's sword. His face was streaked with dirt, his clothes torn, and he feigned terror and despair. Brought before King Priam, Sinon spun a masterful tale of woe and betrayal. He claimed that he had been left behind as a sacrifice by the Achaeans, a victim of Odysseus's malice, intended to ensure a safe voyage home for the Greek fleet. He spoke of the horse as a sacred offering to Athena, built to atone for the Achaeans' sacrilege in stealing the Palladium, the ancient statue of Pallas Athena that protected Troy. He explained that the horse was intentionally made too large to fit through the city gates, for if it were brought within Troy's walls, it would make the city invincible, turning the tide of the war against the Achaeans. This, he claimed, was why they had left it behind, a desperate attempt to deny Troy its ultimate protection. Sinon's performance was utterly convincing. His tears, his trembling voice, his seemingly genuine fear, all served to disarm the Trojans. They pitied him, and in their pity, their suspicions began to wane. Then, as if on cue, a terrifying omen sealed Laocoon's fate and bolstered Sinon's deception. From the sea, two monstrous serpents, their scales glistening, their coils immense, emerged from the waves. They slithered directly towards Laocoon and his 2 young sons, who stood nearby. The serpents coiled around them, crushing them in their powerful embrace, silencing Laocoon's prophetic voice forever. The Trojans, horrified, interpreted this as divine punishment for Laocoon's impiety, for daring to strike the sacred horse. It was a clear sign, they believed, that the gods favored the horse and wished it brought into the city. The debate was over. With shouts of joy and fervent belief, the Trojans set about the monumental task of bringing the horse within their walls. They dismantled a section of their mighty ancient fortifications, tearing down a part of the very defense that had protected them for a decade. With ropes and rollers, they slowly, painstakingly dragged the colossal wooden beast through the breach and into the heart of their city. It was a scene of unparalleled triumph and celebration. The streets of Troy, once silent and war-weary, now echoed with songs of victory. Feasts were prepared, libations poured, and the city, for the first time in 10 years, truly celebrated. They believed the war was over, their trials ended, their future secure. As night fell, the celebrations continued, but gradually, exhaustion claimed the revelers. The city, lulled into a false sense of security, finally succumbed to sleep. The streets grew quiet, the fires dimmed, the gentle murmur of the wind whispered through the triumphant banners. Within the belly of the horse, the Achaean warriors endured a terrifying ordeal. The air was thick with the scent of wood and sweat, the darkness absolute. Every creak of the wood, every distant shout from the celebrating Trojans must have sent shivers down their spines. They heard the sounds of the walls being torn down, the rhythmic thud of the horse being dragged, the joyous cries of their unsuspecting enemies. Their tension must have been unbearable, their muscles aching from the cramped confinement, their minds racing with the enormity of their mission. Perhaps they exchanged silent glances in the oppressive darkness, their hands gripping the hilts of their swords, their hearts pounding a silent rhythm of anticipation. Historians still debate the exact psychological toll this confinement took on the men. Was there fear, doubt, or only a cold, resolute determination? Finally, in the deepest hours of the night, when the city was truly asleep, a prearranged signal was given. Some accounts say it was a torch flashed from the nearby island of Tenedos by the returning Achaean fleet, now silently approaching the Trojan shore. Others suggest it was a signal from Sinon, who had slipped away from the feasting and now waited in the shadows. From a hidden hatch in the horse's flank, Odysseus, ever the leader, was the first to emerge, dropping silently to the ground. He was followed by Menelaus, then the others, one by one. Their movements as stealthy as shadows. They were finally free, standing in the heart of the enemy city, surrounded by sleeping Trojans. Their first act was to open the great Scaean gates, the very gates that had once barred their entry. Meanwhile, Sinon, or perhaps another accomplice, lit signal fires on the city's highest points, guiding the now returned Achaean fleet. The ships, their oars muffled, their sails catching the faintest breath of wind, beached silently on the shore. The Achaean army, their long wait over, poured forth, their armor gleaming faintly in the starlight, their weapons hungry for battle. The city of Troy, so recently vibrant with celebration, was plunged into chaos. The Achaean warriors, now inside the walls, moved swiftly and mercilessly. They set fire to houses, their flames licking at the night sky, illuminating the terror in the eyes of the waking Trojans. The element of surprise was absolute. The Trojans, roused from their sleep, found themselves under attack from within, their defenses breached, their city already burning. The ensuing battle was not a glorious clash of armies, but a brutal, one-sided slaughter. The Achaeans, fueled by 10 years of frustration and a burning desire for vengeance, showed no mercy. King Priam, the venerable ruler of Troy, was slain at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, a grim echo of the war's beginning. Cassandra, the prophetess, whose warnings had always been ignored, was dragged from the temple of Athena, her prophecies of doom finally fulfilled. The women of Troy, once proud and free, were seized as spoils of war, their lives irrevocably shattered. The city that had stood for centuries, a beacon of civilization and strength, was utterly destroyed. Its magnificent walls, once a symbol of its invincibility, now crumbled into dust. The fires raged, consuming homes, temples, and the very fabric of Trojan life. By dawn, Troy was a smouldering ruin, a testament to the devastating power of deception and the bitter cost of war. The Achaeans had won, but their victory was stained with the ashes of a once great city and the echoes of 1,000 desperate cries. The Trojan horse, the ingenious stratagem born from the mind of Odysseus, had not only breached the physical walls of Troy, but had also shattered its spirit, leaving behind a legacy of ruin and a stark warning about the perils of trusting too readily in the gifts of one's enemies. The moon, a sliver of silver against the inky blackness, offered little comfort to the sleeping city. A hush had fallen over Troy, a deep, weary silence that followed the day's revelry and the strange, unsettling departure of the Achaean fleet. Only the rhythmic lapping of waves against the shore and the distant calls of night birds disturbed the peace. Within the city walls, the air was thick with the scent of celebratory wine and the lingering smoke from countless hearths, now banked for the night. The Trojan people, lulled by the false sense of victory and the promise of a new dawn, slept soundly, their dreams perhaps filled with images of peace and rebuilding. They did not know that within their very gates, a silent wooden beast harbored the seeds of their destruction. As the hours crept toward midnight, a faint, almost imperceptible creak echoed from within the belly of the great horse. The air grew still, heavy with an unseen tension. Then, with a soft rasp, a hidden panel slid open. From the darkness, figures began to emerge, one by one, like spectres in the pale moonlight. Odysseus, his face grim and determined, was among the first, his movements swift and silent as a predator. Following him came Menelaus, the man whose grievance had sparked this decade-long war, and Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, a young warrior eager to prove his lineage. These were the elite, the bravest and most cunning of the Achaean forces, hand-picked for this desperate, audacious gamble. Their feet, clad in soft leather, made no sound as they descended from the horse's wooden interior. The ground beneath them felt solid, real after the cramped confinement. They moved with practiced stealth, their eyes scanning the deserted streets, their senses heightened to the slightest sound. The city, so vibrant and bustling just hours before, was now a ghostly labyrinth of shadows and sleeping forms. Their first objective was clear: to signal the waiting fleet. A single, small torch, carefully shielded, was lit and waved 3 times from the highest point of the horse, a beacon of doom against the dark sky. This was the prearranged signal, a silent command that would unleash the full fury of the Achaean army. Out on the open sea, the Achaean ships, which had merely sailed out of sight behind the island of Tenedos, now turned and began their silent return. Oars dipped into the water with muffled strokes, propelled by the urgent, desperate hope of victory. The wind, it seemed, conspired with them, carrying their vessels swiftly and quietly back to the Trojan shore. As they approached, the signal from within the city was spotted. A tiny flicker that nonetheless ignited a fierce resolve in the hearts of the waiting warriors. They disembarked swiftly, their armor clanking softly, and moved towards the city gates. Inside Troy, the warriors from the horse had already begun their grim work. Guided by the faint light of the moon, they made their way to the Scaean gate, the very entrance through which the horse had been pulled. With a combination of brute force and cunning, they overwhelmed the few drowsing guards, their blades glinting briefly in the darkness. The heavy bolts were drawn back, the massive wooden doors groaned open, and the waiting Achaean army poured into the city like a relentless tide. The initial moments of the assault were a terrifying blur of chaos and confusion. The Trojans, roused from their sleep by the sudden screams and the clash of steel, emerged from their homes, disoriented and unprepared. They had celebrated their supposed victory, lowered their guard, and now faced a nightmare made real. The Achaean warriors, fueled by years of frustration and the burning desire for vengeance, showed no mercy. They swept through the narrow streets, their war cries echoing off the stone buildings, a terrifying symphony of destruction. Fires began to erupt almost immediately. Torches were thrown onto thatched roofs, into wooden structures, and onto rich tapestries that adorned Trojan homes. The dry timber, seasoned by years of sun, caught quickly, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the night sky. The flames, at first small, quickly grew into roaring infernos, casting an eerie, flickering light over the unfolding carnage. The air grew thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The once proud city, a beacon of civilization for centuries, was rapidly transforming into a blazing pyre. The fighting was brutal and relentless. Trojans, still half-dressed, grabbed whatever weapons they could find, farming implements, kitchen knives, or simply their bare hands, and fought with the desperate courage of those defending their homes and families. But they were no match for the organized, heavily armed Achaean forces, who had the element of surprise and the burning fervor of long-awaited triumph. Old men, women, and children were caught in the maelstrom, their pleas for mercy often unheard amidst the din of battle. One of the most tragic figures of this night was King Priam himself, the venerable monarch who had ruled Troy with wisdom and dignity for so many years, was awakened by the sounds of the assault. He donned his armor, perhaps a futile gesture of defiance, and attempted to join the fight, even in his advanced age. But he was no longer the warrior of his youth. Accounts vary, but the most poignant tales describe him seeking refuge at the altar of Zeus, a sacred space, only to be brutally slain by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. This act, the sacrilegious murder of an old king at an altar, was seen even by some Achaeans as an act of excessive cruelty, a dark stain on their victory. It highlights a common theme in ancient warfare, the lines between justice and barbarity, often blurred in the heat of conquest. The royal palace, once a symbol of Trojan grandeur, became a scene of particular horror. The Achaeans, knowing it was the heart of the city's power, converged upon it, intent on extinguishing the last vestiges of Trojan rule. Hecuba, Priam's queen, and her daughters, including the prophetess Cassandra, were subjected to unspeakable fates. Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to foresee the future but never to be believed, had warned her people repeatedly about the horse. her frantic prophecies dismissed as madness. Now, as the city burned around her, her visions became a horrifying reality. She was dragged from the temple of Athena, where she had sought sanctuary, by Ajax the Lesser, an act of sacrilege that would later incur the wrath of the gods upon the returning Achaeans. This incident, often debated by scholars, underscores the moral complexities of the war's end and whether the Achaeans, in their moment of triumph, overstepped the bounds of divine favour. Some ancient texts suggest Athena herself intervened, causing a storm to wreck Ajax's ship on his return journey, while others simply depict a general divine displeasure with the Achaeans' hubris. The fate of Hector's young son, Astyanax, was another particularly grim detail of the sack. Feared by the Achaeans as a potential future avenger, the infant was thrown from the towering walls of Troy. A brutal act meant to extinguish any hope of a Trojan resurgence. This cold, calculated cruelty, often attributed to Odysseus or Neoptolemus, serves as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which victors would go to secure their dominance and prevent future rebellion. It is a moment that echoes through the ages as a symbol of the utter devastation wrought by war, where even the innocent are not spared. As dawn approached, the city of Troy was a smouldering ruin. The once proud walls, built by the gods themselves, were breached and crumbling. Temples lay desecrated, their sacred statues toppled and defiled. Homes, filled with generations of memories and treasures, were reduced to ash and rubble. The air was heavy with the stench of death and burning wood, a grim testament to the night's savagery. The cries of the dying had dead, replaced by the mournful wails of the few survivors and the triumphant shouts of the Achaean warriors as they plundered the remains of the city. The Achaeans, after 10 long years of siege, had finally achieved their objective, but their victory was stained with blood and marked by immense destruction. The very ground beneath their feet was now a graveyard. The treasures they sought, Helen and the wealth of Troy, seemed insignificant amidst the desolation. Helen herself, the catalyst for this prolonged conflict, was found and taken back by Menelaus, her fate uncertain, her beauty perhaps now more a curse than a blessing. The fall of Troy was not merely the destruction of a city, it was the end of an era, a cataclysmic event that reshaped the ancient world. The memory of its fall, passed down through oral traditions and later immortalized in epic poetry, served as a cautionary tale for generations. It spoke of the dangers of hubris, the futility of prolonged war, and the devastating consequences of human conflict. The smoke from Troy's burning fires ascended into the morning sky, a dark pall that would linger in the collective memory of humanity for millennia. A silent testament to the night when a mighty city, believing itself safe, was utterly consumed by fire, blood, and despair. And as the Achaean ships, laden with spoils and survivors, began their long, often perilous journey home, the ghosts of Troy, the unburied dead, were left to wander the smoking ruins, their silent cries echoing through the charred remains of their once magnificent city. The wind, which had once carried the shouts of battle and the cries of lamentation across the Trojan plain, now began to whisper tales of departure. Troy, a city that had stood for generations as a beacon of power and prosperity, was reduced to smouldering rubble and skeletal remains. The Achaeans, their victory hard-won and costly, did not linger long amidst the desolation. The gods, whose whims had so often dictated the course of the war, now turned their attention to the homecoming, and their favor or wrath would define the journeys of the returning heroes. Even before the last embers cooled, disputes began to simmer among the Achaean leaders. The division of the spoils, the lingering resentments, and the sheer exhaustion of a decade-long siege frayed the bonds that had tenuously held them together. Agamemnon, the High King, found himself at odds with Odysseus, the cunning strategist, over the proper appeasement of Athena, whose sacred image, the Palladium, had been stolen from Troy. Some accounts suggest that Ajax the Lesser, in his hubris, had desecrated Athena's temple during the sack, an act that deeply offended the goddess and would cast a long shadow over the Achaean fleet. This incident, often overlooked in the grand narrative of the war, is believed by many scholars to be a primary catalyst for the divine vengeance that followed. The first to set sail were those who had managed to avoid the worst of the divine displeasure. Nestor, the wise king of Pylos, was among the fortunate few. Guided by the benevolent hand of Poseidon, he experienced a relatively smooth return, reaching his kingdom without significant loss or delay. His journey stands in stark contrast to the tribulations faced by many of his comrades, serving as a quiet testament to the unpredictable nature of divine intervention. He arrived to find his kingdom largely undisturbed, a rare tranquility in the tumultuous aftermath of war. For others, the journey was fraught with peril from the outset. Menelaus, the king whose wife's abduction had sparked the entire conflict, endured a particularly arduous homecoming. His fleet was scattered by violent storms, a clear sign of divine displeasure, perhaps from Zeus himself or Poseidon, angered by the Achaeans' impiety. He spent years wandering the seas, blown off course to lands as distant as Egypt, where he amassed great wealth but also faced numerous trials. It is said that he consulted Proteus, the old man of the sea, to learn how to appease the gods and secure his return. This long, circuitous journey, lasting as long as the war itself, meant that he did not reach Sparta until 8 years after Troy's fall, a testament to the capricious nature of the sea and the gods who ruled it. The most famous, and perhaps most tragic, of the homecomings belonged to Odysseus, the resourceful king of Ithaca. His journey, chronicled in epic poetry, became a byword for prolonged suffering and cunning survival. His troubles began almost immediately with encounters with the Cicones, the Lotus Eaters, and the monstrous Cyclops, Polyphemus. His blinding of Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon, incurred the sea god's undying wrath, ensuring that Odysseus's path home would be riddled with storms, shipwrecks, and unimaginable delays. He faced the seductive Sirens, the terrifying Scylla and Charybdis, and the enchantress Circe, who transformed his men into swine. His descent into the underworld to consult the prophet Tiresias speaks to the depth of his desperation and the profound spiritual toll of his wanderings. Historians still debate the precise geographical locations of many of Odysseus's encounters, with some suggesting they are purely mythical constructs, while others propose real-world parallels in the Mediterranean. Regardless, his journey, spanning 10 long years, meant he was away from Ithaca for a total of 2 decades, a period during which his kingdom was besieged by persistent suitors vying for his wife, Penelope, and high throne. Agamemnon, the supreme commander, met a fate that was perhaps the most chillingly ironic. He returned to Mycenae, expecting a hero's welcome, only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Clytemnestra had never forgiven Agamemnon for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis to appease Artemis, and secure favourable winds for the fleet's departure to Troy. Her act of vengeance, a dark stain on the triumphant return, highlights the deep-seated grievances and moral complexities that lingered long after the war's end. This tragic homecoming, often seen as a consequence of the hubris and sacrifices demanded by the war, set in motion a cycle of revenge within the house of Atreus, culminating in the matricide committed by Agamemnon's son, Orestes. Even those who seemed to escape the immediate wrath of the gods often found their lives irrevocably altered. Diomedes, the valiant king of Argos, faced domestic turmoil upon his return. His wife Agelaia had taken a lover during his long absence, influenced, some say, by Aphrodite, still nursing a grudge from Diomedes' wounding of her during the war. He was forced to flee Argos and eventually settled in Italy, founding new cities. This exile, though not as dramatic as Odysseus's wanderings, still speaks to the profound disruption the war caused, not just on the battlefield, but within the very fabric of society and family. Idomeneus, the king of Crete, also faced a difficult homecoming. During a violent storm on his return journey, he vowed to Poseidon that if he reached home safely, he would sacrifice the first living thing he met. Tragically, the first to greet him was his own son. While some versions of the myth suggest he fulfilled his vow, leading to a plague and his subsequent exile, others claim he was simply driven out by his people, horrified by the mere thought of such a sacrifice. The ambiguity surrounding his fate underscores the moral dilemmas and impossible choices that often accompanied the returns. The lesser figures, the thousands of common soldiers who had endured the decade-long siege, faced their own struggles. Many found their homes destroyed, their lands desolate, or their families scattered. The social and economic fabric of the Achaean kingdoms was severely strained by the prolonged absence of so many men. The population had dwindled, resources were depleted, and the very concept of a stable life had been upended. The war's legacy was not merely the fall of Troy, but the profound, lasting disruption it inflicted upon the victors themselves. The Trojan survivors, few and scattered, also embarked on their own desperate journeys. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and son of Aphrodite, was one of the most prominent. Guided by divine prophecy, he gathered a remnant of his people and set sail to found a new Troy. His epic journey, a mirror to Odysseus's in its trials and tribulations, led him through the Mediterranean, past the ruins of Carthage, and eventually to Italy, where his descendants would, according to later Roman tradition, found the city of Rome. This narrative of a new beginning, rising from the ashes of the old, offered a powerful counterpoint to the Achaean struggles, suggesting that even in utter devastation, the seeds of a new civilization could be sown. The legacy of the Trojan War was not merely the destruction of a city, but a profound reshaping of the ancient world. It ushered in an era of transition, a period often referred to as the Greek Dark Ages, characterized by a decline in population, literacy, and material culture. The grand palaces and centralized authorities that had defined the Mycenaean civilization, the very structures that had enabled the massive undertaking of the Trojan War, gradually faded. Whether this decline was a direct consequence of the war's immense human and economic cost, or merely coincided with broader environmental and social changes, remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. The archaeological evidence suggests widespread destruction at many Mycenaean sites around the time of Troy's fall, but the precise cause and effect relationship is complex and multifaceted. The tales of the Trojan War and its aftermath, passed down through generations, became foundational myths, shaping the identity and worldview of the ancient Greeks. They spoke of the fragility of human endeavor, the inexorable power of fate, and the enduring consequences of war, even for the victors. The heroes, once celebrated for their prowess on the battlefield, became figures of tragedy, their triumphs overshadowed by their sufferings. The winds that once carried the scent of burning wood from Troy now carried the echoes of their long, perilous journeys home, forever marked by the war's tragic legacy. The Aegean Sea, once a highway for armies, became a vast stage for their individual struggles against divine wrath and the relentless currents of destiny. And so the story of Troy, from its mythical origins to its fiery demise and the scattered returns of its conquerors, became a timeless testament to the enduring power of human ambition, divine intervention, and the profound, often sorrowful cost of conflict.